Africa was never supposed to lead the electric vehicle revolution. At least, that's what the world believed. Yet somewhere between low Earth orbit and a dusty test road on the continent, a small startup is quietly challenging everything we think we know about how electric cars get their power. Not from charging stations, not from the grid, but from space. The idea sounds like science fiction at first. Satellites powering electric vehicles across Africa. No plugs, no cables, no waiting hours for a charge. Just energy delivered wirelessly, continuously, wherever the vehicle moves. And that's exactly why people are paying attention. The story begins with a problem that has slowed Africa's EV adoption more than anything else: infrastructure. Vast distances. Unreliable grids. Entire regions where charging stations simply don't exist. Importing the Western EV model into Africa was never going to work. The startup behind this project realized that early on. Instead of asking, how do we build more chargers? They asked something far more radical. What if cars never needed them? Their solution centers on satellite-assisted energy transmission. The vehicles themselves are not being charged in the traditional sense. Instead, they're designed to receive low-level energy signals from orbit, signals that are then converted onboard into usable electrical power. The satellites don't replace the vehicle's battery. They keep it alive, topped up, and stabilized while the car is in motion. Think of it less like filling a tank and more like keeping a heartbeat steady. The startup claims that Africa is uniquely positioned for this approach. Wide, open geography. Less signal congestion. Fewer legacy systems to interfere with new technology. And most importantly, a pressing need for mobility solutions that don't depend on fragile infrastructure. Early prototypes aren't flashy supercars. They're utility vehicles, delivery vans, public transport shuttles, the kind of vehicles that move people, food, medicine, and goods every single day. These test units combine traditional EV batteries with specialized RF receivers, energy conversion modules, and adaptive power management software. The car doesn't wait to run low before seeking energy. It's always listening, always adjusting, always balancing what it stores with what it receives. Critics are quick to raise eyebrows. Energy laws, signal strength, efficiency losses. And the startup doesn't dodge those questions. In fact, they lean into them. They admit this isn't about infinite power. It's about sufficiency. Enough energy to extend range. Enough to reduce grid dependence. Enough to make EVs viable in places where chargers may never exist. Behind closed doors, pilot programs are already being discussed with logistics companies, regional transit authorities, and off-grid communities. Not massive rollouts, but carefully controlled environments where data matters more than headlines. Because if this works, even partially, the implications are enormous. EV ownership would no longer be tied to urban wealth. Rural mobility would no longer depend on diesel. And Africa wouldn't be following the energy transition, it would be redefining it. What makes this plan even more interesting is how quietly it's unfolding. No global press tour. No flashy CEO promises. Just incremental testing, satellite calibration, vehicle retrofitting, and data collection. The startup knows something critical. The moment they overpromise, the world will stop listening. So instead, they're letting the vehicles speak. Every kilometer driven without plugging in. Every route completed where charging was impossible. Every data packet transmitted back, from orbit to road. And as these tests continue, the question isn't whether satellites will replace chargers overnight. The real question is far more unsettling. If that question makes people uncomfortable, it's because it challenges more than just technology. It challenges the entire business model behind modern energy. Charging networks, grid upgrades, power utilities, even national energy strategies are all built around one assumption. Electricity must move through wires, stations, and centralized control points. This startup's approach quietly steps around that assumption instead of confronting it head-on. And that's why it's dangerous, in the disruptive sense. As testing expanded, something unexpected began to surface. The vehicles weren't just staying operational longer. Their energy consumption patterns were changing. Engineers noticed smoother power curves, fewer deep discharge cycles, and significantly less battery stress. In simple terms, the cars were aging more slowly. That matters. Battery degradation is one of the biggest hidden costs in EV ownership. If satellite-assisted energy input can reduce that wear, even marginally, the economics of electric vehicles shift overnight. A car that lasts longer, travels farther, and depends less on the grid isn't just convenient, it's transformative. The startup began mapping energy corridors. These are regions where satellite coverage, terrain, and vehicle density align perfectly. Not highways in the traditional sense, but invisible pathways in the sky where energy availability is strongest. Vehicles entering these zones experience a subtle but measurable boost in efficiency. Drivers don't see a lightning bolt or glowing dashboard. They just notice something strange. The battery percentage doesn't fall as fast as it should. For fleet operators, this changes everything. Routes that once required midday charging stops suddenly become viable nonstop runs. Remote deliveries stop being logistical nightmares. Emergency vehicles gain extended operational windows in areas with zero infrastructure. And slowly interest spreads, not from consumers, but from governments. Several African nations, facing mounting fuel costs and grid instability, begin exploratory talks. Not to replace their power systems, but to supplement them. Satellite-powered EV fleets could act as mobile infrastructure, operating independently during blackouts, disasters, or fuel shortages. In other words, resilience. Of course, skepticism remains fierce. Some critics label the concept energy theater. Others dismiss it as rebranded wireless charging with better marketing. The startup responds the only way that matters, by releasing anonymized performance data. Not claims, not theories. Real-world numbers collected over thousands of kilometers. The data doesn't promise miracles. It shows something more believable. Incremental gains, consistent stabilization, and a clear reduction in dependence on ground-based charging. And that's when the narrative begins to shift. This isn't about powering cars from space. It's about loosening the grip of infrastructure on mobility. Africa's role in this story is no longer symbolic. It's practical. The continent isn't adopting a futuristic experiment. It's solving a present-day problem with unconventional tools. Where others see limitations, this startup sees design freedom. And as more vehicles roll out, one quiet truth becomes impossible to ignore. The future of EVs may not be decided in Silicon Valley or Europe's industrial corridors. It may be decided under open skies, on roads where plugs were never an option, by engineers who asked a question no one else was willing to ask. Because once that question is asked, it refuses to stay theoretical. As pilot programs expand beyond controlled routes, the startup begins allowing everyday drivers to participate, teachers, delivery workers, rideshare operators. People with no technical background. No briefing about satellites. No explanation beyond one instruction. Drive normally. And they do. Weeks pass. Then months. The feedback is subtle but consistent. Drivers report fewer charging interruptions. Routes feel lighter, as if the car is working with them instead of against them. Some even forget the last time they plugged in until they stop to think about it. Behind the scenes, engineers are watching something even more important: behavioral change. Drivers stop planning their day around charging stations. Anxiety fades. Range stops dominating decision-making. Mobility becomes instinctive again, closer to how fuel cars once felt. But without the fuel, that psychological shift is massive. Because the hardest barrier to EV adoption was never the motor or the battery. It was trust. Trust that the vehicle won't leave you stranded. Trust that energy will be there when you need it. Trust that technology won't dictate your freedom of movement. And this system begins restoring that trust, quietly. As word spreads, competitors start paying attention. Not publicly. Not with announcements. But with patent filings, internal research memos, and sudden hiring sprees focused on orbital communications and power optimization. Something is happening. Not a breakthrough headline, but a slow realignment. Meanwhile, the startup faces its biggest challenge yet: scale. One vehicle is a proof. 100 is a test. Thousands begin to stress the system. Satellite time, signal prioritization, regulatory approval across borders. Every expansion adds friction. And yet, instead of collapsing, the system adapts. Machine learning models adjust energy distribution patterns in real time. Vehicles communicate passively, not requesting power, but signaling need. The satellites respond like traffic controllers in orbit, optimizing flow without centralized micromanagement. No single vehicle is powered. The network is balanced. That distinction matters, because it means the system doesn't fail dramatically. It degrades gracefully. Even partial coverage still delivers benefit. Even imperfect conditions still reduce dependency on the grid. This isn't replacement energy. It's support energy. And that makes it far harder to attack, regulate, or shut down. As discussions reach international forums, the language changes. Officials stop asking, "Does this violate physics?" and start asking, "How do we classify this? Is it telecom? Is it transportation? Is it energy infrastructure?" No one is sure. And in that uncertainty, innovation slips through. The startup never claims to have solved energy. They claim something more defensible and more disruptive. They've decoupled mobility from certainty, from fixed locations, from plugs, from predictable infrastructure. And once mobility is flexible, everything downstream begins to bend. Cities, logistics, emergency response, even economics. But the most interesting part of the story isn't what's happening now. It's what hasn't happened yet, because the system hasn't reached its limit. And somewhere between the satellites above and the roads below, a new kind of transportation ecosystem is quietly taking shape, one that doesn't announce itself with explosions or revolutions, but with a simple, unsettling realization. The car didn't need to stop. And once people notice that the car didn't need to stop, a deeper question begins to surface. If vehicles can move with less dependence on fixed energy points, what else has been overdesigned? Urban planners start paying attention. In cities where charging stations were once planned every few kilometers, those blueprints quietly get revised. Not scrapped, just softened. Fewer stations, smaller hubs, more flexibility. Space once reserved for heavy infrastructure is suddenly available again. That space matters in African cities where land is scarce, budgets are tighter, and demand is growing fast. Logistics companies are next. Fleet managers notice something subtle in their dashboards. Route optimization algorithms begin favoring efficiency over proximity to chargers. Deliveries extend farther into rural regions. Cold chain transport becomes more reliable. Even night operations expand because downtime shrinks. Energy, once the bottleneck, is no longer the loudest constraint. Inside the startup, the tone changes. Early excitement gives way to responsibility, because now the stakes are higher. Any failure won't just be a technical issue. It will be proof for skeptics who are waiting. So the company does something unusual. They slow down. Instead of rushing expansion, they focus on edge cases. Dust storms, heavy rain, mountainous terrain, urban signal interference. They deliberately send vehicles into the worst possible conditions, not to impress anyone, but to break the system before the world does. Some tests fail. Coverage drops. Efficiency gains shrink. In a few regions, the satellite advantage nearly disappears. And that's exactly the data they were looking for. Because failure reveals boundaries. And boundaries define reality. The next iteration doesn't chase perfection. It chases reliability. Hybrid models emerge. Vehicles that combine satellite-assisted energy with regenerative braking, microsolar surfaces, and ultra-efficient power management. No single source carries the load. Each one eases the burden on the others. The result isn't a miracle car. It's a resilient one. Meanwhile, something else is happening outside the labs. Young engineers across Africa start paying attention. Not because of satellites, but because of ownership. This isn't imported infrastructure. It's locally adapted, locally tested, and locally scaled. Universities begin informal partnerships. Students study real telemetry instead of textbook hypotheticals. For the first time, cutting-edge mobility research feels close, reachable, and that may be the most disruptive outcome of all. Because technology doesn't spread fastest through press releases. It spreads through belief. Belief that solutions don't have to come from elsewhere. Belief that constraints can be worked around, not waited out. Belief that the future doesn't require permission. And as the startup prepares its next phase, larger fleets, cross-border trials, more complex routes, one thing becomes clear. This was never about proving satellites could help power EVs. It was about proving that Africa doesn't have to follow the same path everyone else took. It can take a different one. And as that path continues to take shape, the outside world starts to lean in closer, not with applause but with questions. Hard ones. International energy analysts begin dissecting the data. They don't argue that satellites are powering cars in the traditional sense anymore. That debate fades. Instead, they focus on what's harder to dismiss: reduced load, extended range, behavioral independence. The conversation shifts from physics to systems, because systems are where real change hides. One report quietly notes that even a 10 to 15% reduction in grid dependence, spread across thousands of vehicles, could delay billions in infrastructure spending. Not eliminate it, delay it. And in developing economies, time is everything. Time to build. Time to stabilize. Time to choose better paths. Back on the roads, drivers don't care about reports. They care about outcomes. A farmer reaches a market farther than before. A mobile clinic stays operational longer. A delivery rider finishes a shift without hunting for a plug. Small wins. But small wins accumulate. The startup's vehicles begin showing up in places EVs were never expected to survive: border regions, mining roads, coastal humidity zones. Each environment feeds new data back into the system, refining models, tightening margins, improving predictability. The cars don't become invincible. They become dependable. And dependability changes adoption curves more than hype ever could. Still, the biggest test looms ahead. Not technical. Not regulatory. Economic. Can this model remain affordable? Can satellite access scale without locking users into expensive subscriptions? Can local manufacturing keep pace without drifting into dependency on foreign supply chains? The startup doesn't answer publicly. Instead, they do something telling. They open parts of the system. Not the entire technology, but the interfaces. APIs for fleet optimization. Open telemetry standards. Local integration tools. They allow regional developers to build on top of the platform instead of beneath it. An ecosystem forms. Not controlled. Not centralized. But connected. And suddenly, the idea grows beyond vehicles. Energy-aware buses. Autonomous delivery carts. Mobile power units that move where the grid cannot. The original concept, satellites assisting EVs, begins to feel small compared to what's emerging. A mobility layer. An adaptive layer. A way for movement to negotiate with energy instead of waiting for it. And somewhere in all of this, a quiet realization settles in. The most important innovation wasn't in orbit. It was in mindset. In refusing to accept that progress must follow the same blueprint everywhere. In designing for reality instead of ideal conditions. In asking not, what does the world do, but what do we need? That question continues to echo across test routes, design meetings, and open roads. And as long as it does, this story isn't finished. And that is where this story finally pauses, not with a conclusion but with a threshold. Because what began as an unconventional idea has quietly matured into something harder to ignore, a working alternative to how mobility and energy have been forced to coexist. Not a replacement, not a miracle, but a shift in balance. Across Africa, vehicles move with less hesitation. Fleets operate with fewer constraints. Planning becomes about people and purpose, not plugs and proximity. The satellites overhead don't dominate the system, they support it, like an invisible layer of resilience woven into everyday motion. This startup didn't power cars from space. It powered choice. The choice to design for environments that were never part of the original EV equation. The choice to reduce dependence without demanding perfection. The choice to build forward instead of waiting to catch up. And perhaps that is the real legacy taking shape here. Not a headline. Not a single technology. but a reminder that innovation doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it rolls forward quietly, under open skies.